The glass shook in Elena Marsh's hand before she even realized she was crying. Around her, the ballroom glittered with gold light and soft music, and 200 guests raised their champagne toward her younger sister, Camille, who stood glowing beside her fiancé, Nathaniel Voss. Elena sat at a small table near the back, half hidden behind a pillar wrapped in white flowers, and no one had noticed she was there for almost an hour. She had arrived early. She had helped the event planner fix the seating chart when 3 tables were mixed up. She had calmed Camille down when the florist delivered the wrong shade of roses. She had done everything a good sister does on the biggest night of another woman's life, and now she sat alone, watching the party swirl around her like she was furniture. A waiter passed and refilled her water instead of her wine, assuming, perhaps, that she was someone's assistant rather than family. Elena did not correct him. She was used to being overlooked. She had been overlooked since she was 19 years old, since the night their mother died, and their father, Gerald Marsh, had looked at her with red, broken eyes and said, "You'll have to be strong now, for Camille." She had been strong. For 12 years, she had been strong. She skipped college scholarships so she could work and help pay for Camille's private school. She missed her own 21st birthday because Camille had a school play that same weekend, and their father insisted the family needed to be there for her. She gave up a job offer in another city because Camille cried and said she couldn't imagine life without her big sister nearby. And tonight, Camille was marrying into one of the most respected families in the city, and Elena was the woman sitting behind a pillar, invisible, in a room full of people who owed her more than they knew. The toasts began. Gerald stood first, tall and proud in his gray suit, and spoke about his daughter Camille as though she were the only child he had ever raised. He talked about her spirit, her light, her beauty, the way she had always known how to make a room feel warm. He did not once mention Elena, not even in passing, not even as a footnote. Elena smiled anyway, because that was what she always did. She smiled and clapped, and pretended the ache in her chest was something else. Then Margaret Voss, Nathaniel's mother, rose to speak. She was an elegant woman, with silver hair pinned into a perfect twist, the kind of woman who measured people the way a jeweler measures stones, searching for flaws. Her eyes swept the room as she spoke about her son's excellent taste, about how Camille was exactly the kind of woman this family needed, polished, poised, destined for great things. Then her gaze landed on Elena. "And of course," Margaret said, her voice dipping into something almost pitying, "we're so glad Camille's sister could join us tonight. It must be lovely to finally have something to celebrate in this family." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby tables, quiet, polite, cruel in the way only polished cruelty can be. Elena felt her face grow hot. She looked down at the tablecloth, at the small crease she had been folding and unfolding with her fingers for the last 10 minutes, and she said nothing. Camille, radiant in white and diamonds, did not defend her. She simply laughed along, a light, tinkling laugh that told the room this was fine. This was just a joke, nothing to worry about. Their father chuckled too, shaking his head, as if Margaret had made a clever little observation, rather than humiliated his eldest daughter in front of everyone he knew. Elena stared at her hands. She thought about excusing herself to the restroom, just for a few minutes, just long enough to press a cold towel to her eyes and remember how to breathe. But before she could stand, a chair scraped against the marble floor on the other side of the room. She looked up. A man was rising from a table near the front, a table reserved for important guests of the Voss family, business partners, and old friends of Nathaniel's father. Elena did not know him. She had never seen him before that night. He was younger than most of the men at that table, maybe in his early 30s, dressed simply but expensively, in a dark suit with no tie, his dark hair slightly out of place, as though he had run a hand through it more than once that evening. His name was Julian Cross, though Elena did not know that yet. She only knew that he was standing, glass in hand, his eyes fixed not on the bride, not on the groom, but on her. The room quieted slightly, curious about the interruption. A few guests exchanged glances. Nathaniel's father leaned toward a colleague and whispered something Elena couldn't hear. Julian's voice, when it came, was calm and clear, carrying easily across the ballroom without him needing to raise it. "I don't usually speak at these things," he said. "I'm not family, and I only met the bride and groom a few months ago through a mutual friend. but I've been sitting here all evening, and I keep thinking about something." He paused, and in that pause, Elena felt every hair on her arms rise. "I watched a woman fix 3 broken seating charts tonight," he continued. "I watched her calm down a florist crisis, without anyone else even realizing there was a crisis. I watched her make sure every single person in this room had a chair, a drink, and a warm welcome. And I never once saw her sit down to enjoy any of it herself, not until the very end." A few heads turned, searching the room, trying to understand who he meant. "I don't know Elena Marsh well," Julian said, and hearing her own name from a stranger's mouth sent a jolt through Elena's chest. "But I know enough to say this. Sometimes the person holding a family together isn't the one standing in the spotlight. Sometimes she's the one making sure everyone else gets to shine, and she does it so quietly, so completely without complaint, that people forget to thank her at all." Margaret Voss's smile had frozen on her face. Gerald Marsh's jaw had tightened. Camille's eyes had gone wide, uncertain, flicking between her sister and the stranger who had just, in front of everyone she knew, called out the family's careless cruelty without ever raising his voice. "So tonight," Julian said, lifting his glass higher, "I'd like to propose a different kind of toast. Not just to the bride and groom, though I wish them every happiness, but to Elena, to the people like her, who give everything and ask for nothing, and who deserve, at the very least, to be seen." For one long, suspended moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, chairs began to scrape back. A woman near the front stood first, raising her glass toward Elena with a small, warm smile. Then another guest stood, then another. Within seconds, half the ballroom was on its feet, glasses raised toward the woman who had spent all night believing herself invisible. Elena did not know what to do with her hands. She did not know what to do with her face, which had crumpled somewhere between shock and disbelief. Tears she had been holding back all evening finally spilled over, but they were different tears now, not the bitter, swallowed kind, but something else entirely, something that felt almost like relief. She looked toward Julian, this stranger who had, without warning, without asking her permission, without needing anything from her in return, stood up and told an entire room that she mattered. He was not smiling in a triumphant way. He looked, if anything, a little embarrassed by the attention, as though he hadn't planned to make such a scene, and had simply reached a point where staying silent felt impossible. He gave her a small nod, the kind of nod one gives to say, "I see you," and then he sat back down, letting the moment belong to her rather than to himself. The applause slowly settled. The band, sensing the shift in the room, began playing again, something soft and easy, giving people permission to return to their conversations. But the air in the ballroom had changed, and Elena could feel it, the way certain guests now glanced her way, with something like curiosity, even respect, where before, there had been nothing at all. Camille leaned toward her fiancé and whispered something Elena couldn't hear, her face tight, her earlier glow dimmed by something that looked uncomfortably like jealousy. Gerald did not look at Elena at all. He busied himself refilling his glass, his shoulders stiff, his eyes fixed determinedly on anything but his daughter. Margaret Voss recovered quickly, plastering her smile back into place, and steering the conversation at her table toward safer topics. The flowers, the music, anything that wasn't the moment a stranger had just publicly corrected her cruelty. Elena sat frozen for a long moment, her heart pounding, unsure whether to feel grateful or mortified. Part of her wanted to disappear into the floor. Another part of her, a part she hadn't let herself feel in years, wanted to stand up and breathe deeply for the first time all night. A woman at the next table leaned over, an older guest Elena didn't recognize, and touched her arm gently. "That was beautifully deserved, dear," she said. "Do you know who that young man is?" Elena shook her head. "No, I've never seen him before tonight." The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's Julian Cross. His family owns Cross Maritime, one of the largest shipping companies on the East Coast. He doesn't usually attend events like this. I heard he only came tonight because Nathaniel's father does business with him." Elena felt something strange settle in her stomach. Not quite excitement, not quite fear, something closer to disbelief. She looked across the room again, but Julian had turned to speak with the man beside him, his attention no longer on her, as though he had said what he needed to say, and wanted nothing more from the moment than that. Words seemed to travel through the ballroom in ripples. Elena caught fragments of conversation as she passed tables on her way to the restroom, finally allowing herself that quiet escape. "Did you hear who that was? I had no idea that was Julian Cross. He never speaks at these things. Did you see Margaret's face?" By the time Elena reached the small private lounge just off the main hall, her hands were trembling again, but for entirely different reasons than before. She splashed cool water on her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She saw a woman who had spent 12 years disappearing quietly into other people's happiness. She saw tired eyes, a soft, uncertain mouth, a face that had learned to hold itself carefully so as not to take up too much space. And for the first time, she also saw something else in her reflection, a flicker of the woman she might have been if anyone had ever told her, before tonight, that she deserved to be seen. When she finally returned to the ballroom, the party had moved on, as parties do. The band played something upbeat. Guests danced. Camille stood at the center of it all again, laughing loudly, determined to reclaim the spotlight that had briefly slipped away from her. Elena slipped back to her table near the pillar, but this time, when she sat down, a young server approached and set a fresh glass of champagne in front of her without being asked. "Compliments of the gentleman near the front," the server said quietly, nodding toward Julian's table before moving on to the next guest. Elena looked up, and across the crowded, glittering room, Julian Cross was watching her again, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. He did not wave. He did not smile broadly. He simply held her gaze for a moment, as though checking that she was all right, before turning back to his conversation. Elena wrapped her fingers around the stem of the glass and let herself, just for a moment, feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope, small, fragile, and entirely unfamiliar, but hope all the same. She did not know yet that this single moment, one stranger rising from his seat to speak an uncomfortable truth in a room full of people who preferred comfortable silence, would change the entire direction of her life. She did not know that her father would corner her in the parking garage before the night was over, his voice sharp with anger rather than concern. She did not know that Camille would barely speak to her for the rest of the evening, her jealousy simmering just beneath a fragile smile. She did not know that Julian Cross, a man who had built walls around himself after years of being chased for his fortune rather than his character, had just done something he hadn't done in years, opened a door to someone else without expecting anything in return. All Elena knew, sitting there with tears drying on her cheeks and champagne bubbles rising slowly to the surface of her glass, was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her not as the background of her sister's story, but as the center of her own. And somewhere deep inside her, quiet and uncertain but undeniably present, something that had been asleep for 12 long years had just begun, very gently, to wake up. Gerald Marsh found his daughter in the parking garage 20 minutes after the toasts, standing beside her car with her keys still in her hand, unable to make herself drive away just yet. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Do you have any idea what you just did to your sister's night?" Elena turned slowly, startled by the sharpness in his tone. "I didn't do anything, Dad. I didn't ask him to say any of that." "You didn't have to ask. You sat there and let him make a scene, in front of the Voss family, in front of people who matter to this family's future." Gerald's face was flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. "Camille has been planning this night for months. Months, Elena. And somehow, by the end of it, everyone was talking about you." Elena felt something crack open inside her, something that had been holding steady for 12 years finally giving way. "I have been planning this night too, Dad. I fixed the seating chart. I handled the florist. I have done everything for this family since Mom died, and the one time someone notices, you're angry at me for it?" Gerald's jaw tightened, but for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like guilt before he buried it beneath frustration. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Elena's voice cracked, but she did not look away. "Tell me, because I genuinely don't understand. Am I supposed to disappear at every family event for the rest of my life, so Camille never has to share attention with anyone? Don't twist my words." "I'm not twisting anything. I'm asking you a question." Elena's hands were shaking now, but she kept her voice steady. "When was the last time you told me you were proud of me? When was the last time you asked how I was doing, really doing, instead of asking whether I'd taken care of something for Camille? Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, filled with 12 years of things neither of them had ever said out loud. I have to get back inside, he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost tired. Camille needs me. Camille always needs you, Elena said softly. That's never been the problem, Dad. The problem is that I've never needed anyone, because I learned a long time ago that nobody was going to show up for me anyway. Gerald did not respond. He turned and walked back toward the elevator, his shoulders slightly stooped, leaving Elena alone in the cold, echoing garage, with tears sliding freely down her face for the second time that night. She got into her car, gripped the steering wheel, and sat there for a long moment before she trusted herself to drive. Her phone buzzed against the passenger seat. She glanced at it, expecting a message from Camille, perhaps something angry, perhaps something guilty. Instead, the screen showed a number she didn't recognize. I hope I didn't overstep tonight. I only said what I saw. Julian Cross. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. She had not given anyone her number that night. She hadn't spoken more than a passing greeting to a handful of guests. She had no idea how Julian Cross had gotten it, and for a brief, wary second, she wondered if she should be concerned. Then a second message arrived. I asked Nathaniel's assistant for it. I understand if that was inappropriate. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Something about the honesty of the admission eased her wariness. She typed a reply before she could second-guess herself. You didn't overstep. Nobody has ever done anything like that for me before. The response came quickly, as though he had been waiting. Then it was long overdue. Elena smiled. A small, surprised smile. The first genuine one she had allowed herself all evening. She typed back, "Thank you. Truly." And then, hesitating only slightly, she added, "I should have introduced myself properly, instead of just sitting there like a statue. I'm Elena." "I know," he replied. I asked. "I hope that's not too forward." "It's not," she wrote. "It's the first time all night someone bothered to learn my name, instead of assuming it." They continued texting as she sat in the parking garage, then as she drove home, then as she sat curled up on her couch in the small apartment she had never quite been able to afford to decorate the way she wanted, always saving instead for whatever Camille needed that month. Julian told her, in careful, measured sentences, that he rarely attended events like the one that evening, that he had come only as a favor to a business associate, that he generally avoided rooms full of people who wanted something from him. "I noticed you the moment I walked in," he wrote. "Not because you were trying to be noticed, because you weren't trying at all. You were just working, quietly, making sure everyone else had what they needed." Elena read the message twice before responding. "That's what I've always done. I don't really know how to be anything else." "Maybe you don't have to be anything else," Julian wrote back. "Maybe you just have to be allowed to sit down once in a while and let someone else do the noticing." Elena set her phone down on her chest and stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, feeling something unfamiliar unfurl in her chest, something between hope and fear, something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could remember. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the harbor his family's shipping company had built its fortune on, Julian Cross sat at his desk with his phone in his hand, staring at the last message Elena had sent. His assistant, Henry, had asked him twice already why he had left the engagement party early, and twice Julian had brushed the question aside. The truth was, Julian rarely felt compelled to speak up in rooms full of strangers. He had spent the better part of a decade learning to stay quiet in social settings, learning that saying too much, revealing too much interest, too much warmth, invited people to circle him like sharks scenting blood in the water. He had been burned before, badly, by a woman named Vivian, who had spent 2 years pretending to love him, only to be caught, in the end, negotiating a settlement with his family's lawyers, before she'd even ended things with him properly. Since then, Julian had built walls so high, and so careful, that even his closest friends rarely saw past them. He attended events out of obligation, shook hands out of necessity, and left as quickly as decency allowed. He had not planned to say a single word at Camille and Nathaniel's engagement party. But then he had seen Elena. He had watched her move through the room all evening, solving problems no one else even noticed existed, refilling a nervous bridesmaid's water glass, quietly redirecting a confused elderly guest to the correct table, catching a falling floral arrangement before it could crash to the floor, all without ever once drawing attention to herself. And then he had watched Margaret Voss, a woman he'd known for years and never particularly liked, humiliate her in front of the entire room. And something in him, something that had been silent and careful for a very long time, had simply refused to stay seated. He had not planned the words. They had simply come, pulled up from somewhere honest and unguarded, a place he usually kept locked away in rooms full of strangers. And when he'd sat back down, heart pounding harder than he cared to admit, he had felt something he hadn't felt in years. The strange, unfamiliar relief of having done something entirely for someone else's sake, expecting nothing in return. Now, sitting in his penthouse with her name glowing on his phone screen, Julian felt that same unfamiliar warmth again, gentler this time, quieter, but no less real. "I don't usually do this," he typed. "Reach out to someone I just met." "Neither do I," Elena replied. "Reply to someone I just met, I mean. Especially not at midnight. It's nearly 1, actually. Even worse then." Julian smiled at his phone, an actual smile, the kind his assistant would have been shocked to witness. "Would it be too forward to ask if I could see you again? Not at some enormous party, somewhere quiet." Elena stared at the message for a long time before answering. 12 years of putting herself last whispered caution in her ear. A lifetime of disappointment told her that men like Julian Cross, men with fortunes and family names printed in business magazines, did not stay interested in women like her for long. But another voice, smaller and newer, the one that had woken up somewhere in that ballroom, when an entire room of strangers had risen to their feet for her, whispered something different. "You deserve to find out," that voice said. "Just this once, let yourself find out." "I'd like that," she finally typed. "Somewhere quiet sounds perfect." Julian's reply came almost instantly, as though he had been holding his breath waiting for her answer. "Then it's a plan. I'll be in touch tomorrow, once you've had some sleep, and this doesn't feel like a strange, complicated blur." "It already feels like that," Elena admitted. "Good," Julian wrote. "That means it's real." Elena set her phone on the nightstand and lay back against her pillows, staring at the ceiling, replaying the entire night in her mind. The humiliation, the shock, the standing ovation, the strange, careful kindness of a stranger's texts, arriving one after another, like small, steady lights in a dark room. She thought of her father's anger in the parking garage, of Camille's frozen, uncertain expression, when the room had turned toward her sister instead of the bride. She knew, somewhere deep down, that tonight had changed something in her family that could not easily be undone. She knew there would be consequences, uncomfortable conversations, perhaps even more anger, before any of this settled into something manageable. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena Marsh fell asleep not thinking about what she owed everyone else, but about the strange, quiet hope of what she might, finally, be allowed to want for herself. The following morning, Elena woke to 17 missed messages, and not one of them was from Julian. Camille had sent most of them, each one angrier than the last. The first few asked, with forced politeness, whether Elena had planned the whole thing with Julian in advance. By the 5th message, the politeness had evaporated entirely. "You humiliated me at my own engagement party. Do you have any idea how that looked? Everyone was talking about you instead of me. This was supposed to be my night." Elena read each message twice, her stomach tightening with a familiar, dreaded feeling. The one she always got when Camille was upset. The automatic urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to make herself smaller so her sister could feel bigger again. She had done it 1,000 times before. It would have been so easy to do it again. Instead, she set the phone down and made herself a cup of coffee, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let the messages sit unanswered while she drank it. By mid-morning, her phone rang. It was her father. "Your sister is a wreck," Gerald said without greeting. "She barely slept. You need to call her and apologize." "Apologize for what exactly?" Elena asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "For the scene last night." for taking attention away from her big moment. Elena closed her eyes and pressed her fingers against her temple. Dad, I didn't take anything from anyone. I sat quietly at my table all night, exactly like I always do. A man I had never met before decided to say something kind about me. That's not something I did. That's not something I owe anyone an apology for. You could have stopped him. How? By standing up in the middle of his toast and telling him to sit back down? Do you understand how that would have looked? Gerald was quiet for a moment. I just don't want this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be. Camille's wedding is in 4 months. The Voss family is important to her future. We can't afford tension right now. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. So it's fine for Margaret Voss to humiliate me in front of 200 people, but it's not fine for someone to defend me, because that might create tension with the Voss family. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said, Dad. You just didn't want to hear it out loud. Elena's voice trembled, but she kept going. I have spent 12 years making sure nothing ever became a bigger issue than it needed to be, for this family. I have swallowed every hurt feeling, skipped every opportunity, given up every plan I ever had for myself, so that Camille's life could stay smooth and easy. And the one single time, someone stands up for me, you're asking me to apologize for it. There was a long silence on the line. When Gerald finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost uncertain. I don't know what you want me to say, Elena. I don't want you to say anything, she replied softly. I want you to actually think about what I just said, that's all. She ended the call before he could respond, her hands trembling slightly as she set the phone down on the counter. It was the first time in her adult life she had ever hung up on her father, and the silence that followed felt enormous, terrifying, and strangely freeing all at once. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately, and her stomach dropped, certain it was her father calling back, angry. Instead, Julian's name appeared on the screen. Good morning. I hope last night wasn't too complicated once you got home. Elena exhaled slowly, grateful for the distraction. It was complicated. Still is, honestly. But I'm glad you texted. I've been thinking about you all morning, Julian wrote, which is unusual for me. I don't typically think about people I met the night before. Should I be flattered or concerned? Flattered, Julian replied. Definitely flattered. Elena found herself smiling at her phone for the second time in less than 12 hours, an experience so foreign after the previous night's family drama that it almost felt like whiplash. Are you free this evening? She asked, surprising herself with her own boldness. I could use somewhere quiet to think, and apparently you offered. I did offer, Julian confirmed. There's a small place near the harbor. Quiet, good food. No one will bother us there. I'll send the address. They agreed to meet at 7. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange, suspended state, half dreading another call from her father or sister, half unable to stop thinking about the evening ahead. She changed her outfit 3 times before settling on something simple, a soft green dress she had bought over a year ago and never worn, tucked in the back of her closet for an occasion she had never quite believed would come. The restaurant Julian had chosen was tucked into a quiet street near the harbor, small and unassuming from the outside, the kind of place easy to walk past without noticing. Inside, it was warm and dimly lit, with only a handful of tables, most of them empty. Julian was already seated when she arrived, standing immediately when he saw her, pulling out her chair with an old-fashioned courtesy that felt entirely unforced. You found it, he said, smiling. Your directions were very clear, Elena replied, settling into her seat, suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't quite anticipated. They talked for hours. Julian asked about her work, and Elena found herself explaining, somewhat sheepishly, that she managed logistics for a small nonprofit that provided school supplies to underfunded classrooms across the city. Work she loved but rarely discussed, because it never seemed impressive enough to mention at family gatherings, dominated by Camille's more glamorous pursuits in event planning. That sounds far more meaningful than most of what I do, Julian said, and he meant it, she could tell. What do you do exactly? Elena asked. I mean, I know Cross Maritime is your family's company, but what does that actually mean for your day-to-day? Julian's expression shifted slightly, something guarded flickering behind his eyes before he answered. Mostly meetings. Mostly making decisions that affect people I'll never meet, in cities I've never visited. It's important work, but it's lonely, in its own way. Most people I meet through the company want something from me before they even know my name. That sounds exhausting, Elena said softly. It is, Julian admitted. That's part of why last night surprised me so much. I wasn't planning to say anything. I don't usually let myself get involved in things that aren't mine to get involved in. But watching you sit there, taking that kind of unkindness without any defense, I just couldn't stay quiet. Elena looked down at her plate, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time. I don't think you understand how much that meant. Nobody has ever done anything like that for me before. Not once. In 12 years. Then everyone around you has been failing you for 12 years, Julian said simply. No anger in his voice. Only quiet conviction. That's not a reflection of your worth. That's a reflection of their blindness. They talked until the restaurant staff began quietly stacking chairs at nearby tables, a polite hint that closing time approached. Julian walked her to her car, and neither of them rushed the goodbye, lingering in the cool evening air, with the harbor lights glimmering in the distance behind them. I'd like to see you again, Julian said, if that's something you'd want. It is, Elena said, and she meant it more fully than she had meant almost anything in years. Driving home that night, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. The quiet, unfamiliar sensation of her life beginning to belong to her again. She thought of her father's anger, of Camille's unanswered messages still sitting in her phone, of the difficult conversations she knew were still ahead of her. But for tonight at least, she allowed herself to simply feel good, to simply feel seen, without guilt, without apology, without shrinking herself to fit into someone else's comfort. She did not yet know how much harder the coming weeks would become, how deeply her family's resentment would grow, how Camille's jealousy would sharpen into something far more dangerous than a few angry messages. She did not know that Julian Cross carried his own wounds, quiet and carefully hidden, wounds that would eventually test whether what was growing between them could survive the storm that was building around them both. All she knew, lying in bed that night with her phone glowing softly on the nightstand, and one final message from Julian still open on the screen. Good night, Elena. Thank you for trusting me with your evening. Was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had something worth protecting. Something entirely her own. Camille's fist hit the apartment door so hard that Elena nearly dropped the mug she was holding. Open the door, Elena. I know you're in there. Elena set the mug down carefully, her heart already pounding, and crossed the small living room to unlock the door. Camille stormed past her before she had even fully stepped aside, her heels clicking sharply against the wood floor, her face flushed with an anger Elena hadn't seen directed at her in years. You went on a date with him, Camille said, spinning to face her. Julian Cross. You actually went on a date with him. How do you even know that? Nathaniel's mother has friends everywhere, Elena. Did you really think no one would see you two at that restaurant? Camille's voice cracked with something that sounded less like concern and more like betrayal. Do you understand what you're doing? He's not just some man. He's connected to everyone Nathaniel's family does business with. If this goes wrong, if you embarrass yourself, or him, it reflects on all of us. Elena stared at her sister, something inside her hardening quietly. You're worried this reflects on you. I'm worried about the family. No, Elena said, her voice steadier than she expected. You're worried about your wedding. About what the Voss family will think if my life suddenly becomes interesting enough to compete with yours. Camille's mouth opened, then closed. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like the sister Elena remembered from childhood, before the world had taught Camille that attention was a currency worth hoarding. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by the same defensive anger. That's not fair, Camille said. Isn't it? Elena crossed her arms. Camille, for 12 years, I have made myself small so you could be big. I skipped my own opportunities so you could have every one of yours. I have never once complained, not really, because I loved you, and because I told myself that was just what sisters did. But I am done apologizing for one dinner with a man who was kind to me. He humiliated me at my own party. He told the truth at your party, Elena said quietly. There's a difference. even if it's uncomfortable to hear. Camille's eyes filled with tears, but Elena had learned, slowly and painfully over the past 2 days, to recognize the difference between her sister's genuine hurt and her practiced, performative distress. This felt closer to the latter, though some small, guilty part of Elena still ached at the sight of her sister crying. "I don't know who you are right now," Camille said, her voice trembling. "You've never talked to me like this." "Maybe I should have, a long time ago," Elena replied. "Camille, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just want, for once in my life, to be allowed to have something good happen to me, without it becoming a crisis for everyone else." Camille wiped her eyes, her expression shifting into something colder, more calculated. "Fine. Have your little fling. But don't expect me to pretend everything is normal when it inevitably falls apart. Men like Julian Cross don't stay interested in women like you, Elena. You should enjoy it while it lasts." The words landed exactly where Camille intended them to land, and for a moment, old doubts stirred in Elena's chest, whispers of unworthiness she had carried since childhood. But she pushed them down, refusing to let her sister see the wound she'd just opened. "Maybe you're right," Elena said evenly. "Or maybe, for the first time in my life, something good is finally happening, because I deserve it, not because I earned it by disappearing." Camille left without another word, slamming the door hard enough that a picture frame on the wall rattled. Elena stood alone in the sudden silence of her apartment, her hands shaking, tears finally slipping free now that no one was watching. She thought about calling Julian, then hesitated, unsure whether she wanted him to see her like this, unsteady and raw. But her phone buzzed before she could decide, and his name appeared on the screen as though he had sensed the moment from across the city. "Are you free this weekend? My grandfather wants to meet you." Elena stared at the message, momentarily forgetting her sister's cruel words entirely. "Your grandfather? He's the only family I actually trust," Julian wrote. "He built the company from nothing. He's the one who taught me that a person's character matters more than their bank account, and he's been asking about you since I mentioned you existed. Fair warning, he's blunt. He'll probably interrogate you a little." Elena found herself smiling, despite the ache still lingering in her chest. "I think I can survive a little interrogation." "Good," Julian replied. "Because I think he's going to like you far more than he's ever liked anyone I've brought around before." That weekend, Elena drove out to a modest, elegant house on the edge of the city, far smaller and less ostentatious than she had expected from a family worth as much as the Cross family. Julian met her at the door, looking more relaxed than she had seen him yet, dressed casually in a soft gray sweater instead of his usual tailored suits. "He's already made tea," Julian said, leading her inside. "That means he's decided to be charming instead of terrifying. Consider yourself lucky." Julian's grandfather, a sharp-eyed man named Edmund Cross with silver hair and hands roughened from decades of work before the company had grown into an empire, greeted Elena with a firm handshake and an assessing gaze that reminded her uncomfortably of a teacher checking homework. "So," Edmund said, once they were settled in his sitting room, tea steaming between them, "you're the young woman who made my grandson break 20 years of careful silence at a party full of strangers." Elena felt her cheeks warm. "I didn't ask him to do that." "I know you didn't," Edmund said, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "That's exactly why it worked. Julian has spent years being chased by women who wanted something from him. The moment someone stops chasing, stops performing, stops trying, that's the moment he actually notices them. You didn't try at all, from what he's told me. You just existed, quietly and honestly, and that terrified him more than any amount of flattery ever could." Julian shot his grandfather a look of mild exasperation, but he did not deny it. Over the course of the afternoon, Edmund asked Elena about her work at the nonprofit, about her family, about what she wanted for her own future, questions no one, not even her own father, had bothered asking in years. Elena found herself answering honestly, more honestly than she had planned to, admitting that she had once dreamed of studying architecture before family obligations rerouted her entire life, admitting that she sometimes wondered what version of herself she might have become if she had ever been allowed to put herself first. "It's not too late for any of that," Edmund said simply. "You're what, 31, 32? Plenty of people build entirely new lives at your age. The only thing standing between you and that life is permission, and you don't need anyone's permission but your own." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, some old, tight knot she had carried since she was 19 years old, standing beside her mother's casket and promising herself she would be strong enough to hold her family together, no matter the cost to herself. Later, walking her to her car as the sun began to set behind Edmund's modest house, Julian took her hand gently, the first time he had done so since they'd met. "He liked you," Julian said. "Genuinely liked you. That's rare." "I liked him too," Elena admitted. "He reminds me a little of what I imagine my mother would have been like if she'd lived long enough to see me grown." Julian squeezed her hand gently. "I want you to know something, Elena. I've been hurt before, badly, by someone who only ever saw dollar signs when she looked at me. It's part of why I've kept myself so guarded for so long. But nothing about you has ever felt like that. Not once. I don't want anything from you except honesty," Elena said quietly. "That's all I've ever wanted from anyone." "Then you already have more from me than most people ever will," Julian replied. They stood together in the fading light, and for a moment, the weight of Camille's cruel words, of her father's disapproval, of 12 years spent disappearing into other people's needs, felt distant and small. Elena allowed herself, just for that moment, to believe that something good was finally, truly hers to keep. She did not yet know that Camille, humiliated and increasingly desperate, was already making calls of her own, already planting the first careful seeds of a rumor that would soon threaten to unravel everything Elena had only just begun to build. The headline appeared on a gossip website before Elena had even finished her morning coffee. "Shipping Heir's New Romance Raises Eyebrows Among Old Friends." Elena read the article twice, her stomach twisting tighter with every sentence. It was carefully worded, never quite crossing into outright accusation, but the implication was unmistakable. Unnamed sources close to the family suggested that Julian Cross's new companion, an event coordinator's older sister with modest means, may have set her sights on the reclusive heir shortly after learning of his fortune. The article included a photo of Elena and Julian leaving the harbor restaurant, her face caught mid-laugh, looking, out of context, exactly like a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted. Elena's hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments beneath the article, strangers speculating cruelly about her intentions, her character, her worth. She set the phone down on the counter and pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Her phone rang almost immediately. "Julian. Have you seen it?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I've seen it," Elena said quietly. "I don't know how they got that photo, but I have a fairly good idea who the unnamed source is." Julian's voice was hard now, harder than Elena had ever heard it. "Nathaniel's assistant let it slip that Camille has been in contact with a reporter friend of hers since the engagement party." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. "Camille did this? I can't prove it yet, but the timing isn't a coincidence." Julian exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, Elena. This is exactly the kind of thing I was trying to protect you from, by keeping things private. I should have been more careful." "This isn't your fault," Elena said, though her voice wavered. "If it's true, if Camille really did this, that's not something you could have prevented." They agreed to meet that evening, and Elena spent the rest of the day in a strange, hollow daze, unable to focus on work, unable to stop refreshing the article to see if it had spread further. By late afternoon, her phone rang again, this time displaying her father's name. "Have you seen what people are saying about you?" Gerald demanded without greeting, his voice tight with what Elena initially mistook for concern. "I've seen it," she said. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Gerald continued. "This is exactly why I told you to be careful. Now the entire city thinks our family raised a gold digger." Elena felt something inside her go very still. "You believe it?" "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Her voice was quiet, but something in it made Gerald pause. "You're not calling because you're worried about me, Dad. You're calling because you're worried about how this looks for the family. Just like always." "That's not fair, Elena. Isn't it?" Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion settling into her bones. "Where were you when Margaret Voss humiliated me in front of 200 people? Where were you when Camille sent me 17 angry messages for the crime of being noticed for once? And now, when a lie is being printed about my character, your first instinct is to worry about the family's reputation, instead of asking whether I'm all right." Gerald was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness. I don't know how to do this differently, Elena. I've spent so long trying to keep this family together after your mother died. I don't know how to do it any other way. Then maybe it's time you learned, Elena said softly, and ended the call. She met Julian that evening at his penthouse, the first time she had been there, and found him pacing near the windows overlooking the harbor, his usual composure fractured by barely restrained frustration. I've already spoken to our legal team about the article, he said as soon as she arrived. We can issue a statement, demand a retraction, but I wanted to talk to you first. I don't want to do anything without your input. This is your life they're dragging through the mud, not just mine. Elena sank onto the edge of his sofa, suddenly exhausted in a way that went far deeper than the day's stress. I don't know what I want, Julian. Part of me wants to fight it, to prove them wrong. Part of me just wants to disappear until it all blows over. Julian sat beside her, close, but careful not to crowd her. For what it's worth, I don't believe a word of it. Not for a second. I've known plenty of people who wanted something from me, Elena. You have never once asked me for anything. You didn't even want me to pay for dinner that first night. I remember, Elena said, a small, tired smile tugging at her mouth despite everything. You practically had to wrestle the check away from me. Exactly. Julian took her hand gently. Whatever your sister did, whatever anyone believes, it doesn't change what I know to be true. But I understand if this is too much, if you need space, or time, or... No, Elena said, more firmly than she expected. I don't want space. I'm just tired of my family treating my life like a problem to be managed instead of something worth protecting. Julian was quiet for a moment, studying her carefully. Then let me help you protect it. Let us fight this together, instead of you carrying it alone. Elena nodded slowly, something steadying inside her, despite the chaos of the day. Okay, together. They spent the evening drafting a careful, measured statement with the help of Julian's legal team, one that neither confirmed nor inflamed the rumors, but firmly denied any suggestion that Elena's interest in Julian was anything but genuine. Julian's publicist released it quietly the following morning, and within a day, the initial article was quietly amended, the more damaging insinuations softened into vague, unremarkable language. But the damage, Elena knew, had already been done in the places that mattered most. Camille had not called to apologize, had not even acknowledged the article's existence. Their father remained distant, uncertain, caught between old loyalties and a growing awareness that something was shifting in his family that he no longer fully understood. A few days later, Elena received an unexpected message from an old childhood friend of Camille's, a woman named Priya who had remained close to the family over the years. I don't know if this is my place to say, Priya wrote, but I think you deserve to know. Camille has been talking to a reporter for weeks. She showed me the messages herself, before the article came out. She said she wanted to remind everyone who the real center of this family's story was supposed to be. Elena read the message 3 times, a strange mixture of heartbreak and clarity settling over her. She had suspected, of course, but seeing it confirmed in writing, seeing proof that her own sister had deliberately tried to damage her reputation out of jealousy, hurt in a way she hadn't fully prepared herself for. She did not respond to Camille. She did not call her father. Instead, she sat with the message for a long time, feeling something inside her shift permanently, some final thread of automatic loyalty finally, quietly, snapping. That evening, she told Julian everything, showing him Priya's message with hands that had finally stopped shaking. He read it silently, his jaw tightening. I'm sorry, he said finally. I know how much you've given for your family. I know how much this must hurt. It does, Elena admitted. But it also makes something very clear. I've spent 12 years protecting people who were never going to protect me back. Maybe it's time I stopped. Julian pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time since the article had appeared, Elena allowed herself to simply be held, without needing to be strong for anyone else, without needing to manage anyone else's feelings about her pain. She did not yet know what confronting Camille would cost her, or whether her father would ever truly choose her side over comfortable silence. But sitting there, in the quiet safety of Julian's arms, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done disappearing. Elena knocked on Camille's door 3 days later, Priya's message still burning in her memory, and when Camille opened it, her sister's face went pale. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you." "I know," Elena said, stepping past her into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, something she had never done before in her life. "I think it's time we talked honestly, for once." Camille closed the door slowly, her earlier composure cracking at the edges. "If this is about the article, I already told you, I don't know anything about." "Don't," Elena said, and something in her voice made Camille stop mid-sentence. "I know, Camille. I have a message from Priya showing exactly what you did. So please, don't stand there and lie to my face on top of everything else." Camille's expression shifted rapidly, guilt flickering through anger, through something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight she had been carrying too long had finally been set down. She sank onto the arm of her couch, suddenly looking much younger than her 28 years. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said quietly. "I just wanted a reporter friend to ask a few questions, to make sure people knew you weren't just some random woman he'd fallen for overnight. I didn't think she'd write something that ugly." "You wanted to control the story," Elena said, "because you couldn't stand that. For once, the story wasn't about you." Camille flinched, as though she'd been slapped, but she did not deny it. Tears filled her eyes, and this time, Elena suspected, they were real. "Do you know what it's like, Elena? Growing up as the daughter everyone worried about, the fragile one, the one who needed protecting after mom died. Everyone always treated me like glass. I never got to be strong, because you were always there being strong for both of us. I never got to prove I could handle anything on my own." "That's not fair," Elena said, though something in her chest ached at the raw honesty of it. "I didn't take your strength from you, Camille. Nobody ever gave me the choice to let you find it yourself." "I know that now," Camille whispered. "I've had a lot of time to think, these past few days, watching that article spread, watching people say those things about you, knowing I caused it. I kept telling myself I was protecting my wedding, my future, but really, I think I was just scared." "Scared of what?" "That once people saw you clearly, really saw you, the way that room saw you at my engagement party, they'd realize you were always the more remarkable one. That I'd spent my whole life being the favorite, for no better reason than being the one who cried the loudest and demanded the most attention." Camille wiped her eyes, her voice breaking. "I'm not proud of what I did. I know I can't take it back." Elena sat down slowly across from her sister, feeling something complicated settle in her chest, not quite forgiveness, but not entirely closed off either. "You hurt me, Camille. Not just with the article, but for years, in small ways I let myself ignore, because I loved you and didn't want to make things harder for you. That doesn't just disappear because you're finally being honest with me now." "I know," Camille said. "I don't expect it to. I just needed you to know I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Not because Dad told me to apologize, or because it's convenient, because I finally understand what I did." They sat together in silence for a long moment, 12 years of complicated history hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice gentler now. "I don't know if I can trust you again right away. I need time. But I don't want to lose you either. Camille, you're still my sister." Camille nodded, tears sliding freely down her face now. "I'll earn it back. I promise. Starting with calling that reporter myself and telling her the truth." Elena left the apartment an hour later, emotionally drained but strangely lighter, as though setting down a burden she had been carrying without realizing its full weight. She drove straight to her father's house, deciding, for once, not to wait for him to reach out first. Gerald answered the door looking older than she remembered, tired lines etched deeper around his eyes. "Elena, I wasn't expecting you." "We need to talk, Dad. Really talk, not just argue past each other like we've been doing." Gerald hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. They sat in the small kitchen, where Elena had grown up, the same table where her mother used to help her with homework, where Gerald had once, 12 years ago, told a 19-year-old Elena that she needed to be strong for her sister. "I talked to Camille today," Elena began. She admitted she was behind the article. Gerald's face paled. "I didn't know that." "I believe you," Elena said. "But Dad, I need you to understand something. For 12 years, I have carried this family. I gave up school, I gave up relationships. I gave up my own dreams. Because you told me I needed to be strong for Camille, and I believed you. Because I loved her, and because I loved you, and because I desperately wanted to make Mom proud by holding us together. Gerald's eyes glistened, and for the first time in longer than Elena could remember, she saw something genuinely vulnerable in her father's expression. I know, he said quietly. I've known for a long time. If I'm honest, I just didn't know how to fix it without falling apart myself. Your mother was the one who held this family together emotionally. When she died, I didn't know how to do that. So I leaned on you, because you were steady, because you never complained, and it was easier than admitting I was drowning too. I needed you to see me, Dad, Elena said softly, tears finally slipping free. Not just as the reliable one, the strong one, but as your daughter, who was grieving too, who needed comfort too, who deserved to be celebrated sometimes, instead of always being the one doing the celebrating for everyone else. Gerald reached across the table and took her hand, his own hand trembling slightly. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry. I let you disappear into taking care of this family, and I never once stopped to ask what it cost you. That night at the engagement party, when that young man stood up for you, my first reaction was anger, because it forced me to see, in front of everyone, exactly what I had been failing to see for 12 years myself. Elena squeezed her father's hand, something long held and painful finally beginning to loosen in her chest. I don't need you to fix 12 years overnight, Dad. I just need you to start seeing me. Really seeing me. I will, Gerald promised. I swear to you, I will. They talked for hours that evening, working through years of silence and misunderstanding, not resolving everything, but beginning, finally, to build something more honest between them. When Elena finally left, driving home beneath a sky scattered with stars, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. The quiet, steady sense of being genuinely known by her own family. She did not yet know that Camille's promised apology to the reporter would trigger a far larger story than any of them anticipated. One that would force Julian's carefully guarded past into the public eye and test everything Elena had only just begun to build with him. But for tonight, driving home with her father's apology still warm in her chest, Elena allowed herself, finally, to simply feel loved. Julian did not answer his phone for 2 full days, and Elena felt something like panic building steadily in her chest with every unanswered call. It had started innocently enough. Camille, true to her word, had called the reporter to correct the record, admitting she had exaggerated details out of jealousy. But in digging deeper to verify the correction, the reporter had stumbled onto something else entirely. An old story about Julian's previous relationship with a woman named Vivian. A story Julian had spent years trying to keep buried. The new article was far more invasive than the first, dredging up details Julian had never made public. The quiet settlement his family's lawyers had arranged years earlier. The humiliating details of how thoroughly Vivian had manipulated him before her true intentions became clear. The piece framed Julian sympathetically enough, painting him as a wounded, guarded man finally opening his heart again with Elena. But Elena understood, reading it, exactly how deeply it must have cut him to have his most private pain exposed so publicly, all because of a chain of events that had started with her own sister's jealousy. She texted him repeatedly, Julian, please, I know this is painful, please just let me know you're okay. Nothing. On the 3rd day, unable to bear the silence any longer, Elena drove to his penthouse and asked the doorman, a kind older man named Walter, who had come to recognize her over the past weeks, to let her up. She found Julian standing at the window overlooking the harbor, exactly where she had first seen his apartment weeks earlier. But everything about him looked different now, hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical tiredness. You shouldn't be here, he said without turning around. Why not? Because everything happening right now is because of your family, Elena. Because your sister decided to weaponize a reporter to protect her own ego. And now my entire past, every humiliating detail of it, is spread across the internet for anyone to read. Elena felt the accusation land like a physical blow, but she made herself stay steady. You're right that Camille started this. She knows that too, and she's devastated by what it's led to. But Julian, you can't blame me for what she did. I'm not blaming you, Julian said, finally turning to face her, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. I'm blaming myself, for letting my guard down, for believing that this time would be different, for forgetting exactly why I built those walls in the first place. This time is different, Elena said, stepping closer. I am not Vivian, Julian. I never asked you for anything. I've never once cared about your money. I know that, Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. Logically, I know that. But right now, everyone I know is reading about the worst, most humiliating chapter of my life, and it's hard not to feel like I'm right back where I started, exposed and foolish for trusting someone. Elena felt tears threatening, but she forced herself to hold Julian's gaze. I'm not going anywhere! I know this hurts! I know you feel exposed, but please don't push me away because you're scared. That's exactly what happened with your family for years, isn't it? Everyone learning to disappear rather than face the hard, uncomfortable feelings underneath. Julian was quiet for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. That's a low blow. Maybe, Elena admitted, but it's also true, and I think you know it. Julian ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I don't know how to do this, Elena. I don't know how to let someone in without bracing myself for the moment they leave. Then let me show you, Elena said softly, closing the distance between them. Let me prove it to you, one day at a time, instead of you deciding in advance that I'm going to hurt you the way she did. Julian looked at her for a long moment, vulnerability etched plainly across his usually composed features. I'm scared, he admitted quietly, the words clearly costing him something to say aloud. I know, Elena said. So am I. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. Something in Julian's expression finally broke, the careful composure crumbling into something rawer, more honest. He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that felt different from anything they'd shared before. Less careful, more desperate. Two people finally allowing themselves to be fully seen by each other. I'm sorry, he murmured into her hair. I shouldn't have shut you out. That wasn't fair to you. You were hurting, Elena said. I understand that more than you might think. They stood together for a long time, the city lights glimmering beyond the window, neither of them speaking, simply allowing the silence to hold what words couldn't fully capture. Finally, Julian pulled back slightly, studying her face. My grandfather called this morning, he said. He read the article. He told me something I think I needed to hear. What did he say? He said that real love isn't about finding someone who will never hurt you, because that person doesn't exist. It's about finding someone who stays anyway, who chooses you again and again, even when things get complicated. Julian's voice softened. He said you seem like exactly that kind of person, and that I'd be a fool to let my own fear push you away. Your grandfather is a wise man, Elena said, a small smile finally breaking through her own exhaustion. He usually is, Julian agreed, annoyingly so. Over the following days, Julian slowly opened up further, telling Elena the full story of his relationship with Vivian, details he had never shared with anyone outside his immediate family, the careful manipulation, the humiliation of realizing, far too late, that someone he'd trusted completely had only ever seen him as a means to an end. Elena listened without judgment, without pity, simply present, allowing him the space to finally process a wound he had kept carefully hidden for years. In turn, Elena found herself opening up more fully as well, sharing memories of her mother, of the crushing weight of grief she had never fully allowed herself to feel, because someone had always needed her to be strong instead. She told him about the architecture scholarship she had turned down, about the quiet ache of watching other people build the lives she had once dreamed of for herself. It's not too late, Julian said one evening, echoing his grandfather's words from weeks earlier. You could still study, if you wanted to. I'd support that completely. I know, Elena said, surprising herself with how true it felt. I think, for the first time in a long time, I actually believe that. Slowly, painfully, the media storm began to settle. Camille issued a full, public apology, taking complete responsibility for the initial article, and refusing to let Julian bear any blame for details that were never his to control. The gesture, unexpected and genuinely brave, softened something in Julian toward Elena's family that had previously seemed unlikely to heal. Your sister surprised me, Julian admitted one afternoon, reading Camille's statement on his phone. That took courage. She's trying, Elena said. I think, for the first time, she's actually trying to be a better person, not just perform being one. As the weeks passed, Elena found herself falling more deeply into a life she had never quite allowed herself to imagine. One where she was cherished, rather than merely relied upon. Celebrated, rather than merely tolerated. Seen fully, rather than glimpsed only in the moments when her usefulness was required. She did not yet know how completely her life was about to change, or how the coming months would test every fragile new bond she had built, both with Julian and with her own reconciling family. But for the first time, in longer than she could remember, Elena Marsh felt genuinely, unmistakably hopeful about what lay ahead. 6 weeks before Camille's wedding, Elena stood in the doorway of a small architecture studio downtown, her heart pounding as though she were about to step off a cliff. She had submitted her application to the evening program 3 weeks earlier, certain nothing would come of it, certain that 32 was too old, that 12 years away from serious study had left her too far behind. When the acceptance email arrived, she had read it 4 times before believing it was real, and now, standing outside the small studio where her first class would begin in 10 minutes, the reality of it finally settled fully into her chest. "You look terrified," Julian said, appearing beside her with 2 coffees, having insisted on driving her despite her protests that she could easily manage the trip herself. "I am terrified," Elena admitted. "What if I'm too far behind? What if everyone else already knows things I've forgotten, or never learned in the first place?" Julian handed her one of the coffees, his expression gentle but firm. "Then you'll learn them now. Elena, you spent 12 years solving problems no one else even noticed, managing logistics for an entire nonprofit, holding a family together through grief most people never fully recover from. You are more capable than you give yourself credit for." Elena took a steadying breath, the warmth of the coffee cup grounding her slightly. "Thank you for driving me. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Julian said simply. "I wanted to be here for this, the same way you've been here for everything I've had to face these past months." Elena smiled, leaning up to kiss him briefly, before squaring her shoulders and walking into the studio, leaving Julian standing outside with a proud, quiet smile of his own. The class was smaller than she'd expected, a dozen students of varying ages, several of them clearly returning to school later in life just as she was. The instructor, a sharp, warm woman named Diane Foster, welcomed them with genuine enthusiasm, and by the end of the first session, Elena found herself surprised by how naturally the old excitement returned, how quickly the fear melted into something closer to joy. She left that evening feeling lighter than she had in years, calling Julian the moment she reached her car. "How was it?" he asked immediately. "It was wonderful," Elena said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "I forgot how much I loved this. I actually forgot, Julian. 12 years of pushing it down so completely that I convinced myself I'd never really wanted it in the first place." "I'm so proud of you," Julian said, and the sincerity in his voice brought sudden tears to Elena's eyes. 2 nights later, Elena arrived at her father's house for a dinner that had become a weekly tradition since their honest conversation weeks earlier, something neither of them had ever managed before, but now guarded carefully, unwilling to lose the fragile new closeness they had built. Camille was there too, having gradually rebuilt enough trust with Elena to be included in these gatherings again, though the wedding planning between them remained a careful, deliberate process rather than the effortless closeness of childhood. "How was your first class?" Gerald asked, setting a plate in front of Elena with a warmth that still felt slightly unfamiliar after years of distance. "It was incredible," Elena said. "I'd forgotten how much I loved it." "I always knew you would have made an excellent architect," Gerald said quietly. "Your mother used to say the same thing, watching you build those little models out of cardboard when you were young. I should have told you that a long time ago, instead of letting you believe your dreams weren't important enough to pursue." Elena reached across the table and squeezed her father's hand, something warm and healing passing between them that no words could fully capture. "I've been thinking," Camille said hesitantly, breaking the comfortable silence that followed. "I want to do something for you, Elena. Something to help make up for everything, even a little." "You don't owe me anything, Camille." "I know," Camille said, "but I want to anyway." She hesitated, twisting her napkin nervously between her fingers, a gesture that reminded Elena sharply of their childhood. "I want you to be my maid of honor. I know I don't deserve to ask that after everything, But you're my sister, and despite everything, you're still the person I trust most in the world, even when I haven't deserved that trust myself." Elena felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "Camille, You don't have to answer right away," Camille said quickly. "I know it's a lot to ask." "I don't need time," Elena said softly. "Yes." "Of course, yes." Camille's face crumpled with relief and gratitude, and for a moment, the two sisters simply looked at each other across the table. 12 years of complicated history and recent, painful growth passing silently between them. Later that evening, as Elena prepared to leave, Gerald walked her to her car, something he had never once done throughout her entire adult life. "I know I can't undo 12 years of not seeing you clearly," he said, standing beside her car in the cool evening air. "But I want you to know how proud I am of you, Elena. Not for what you've done for this family, though that mattered too, for who you are, entirely on your own terms." "Thank you, Dad," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Driving home that night, Elena found herself reflecting on how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. She had a father who finally saw her, a sister, slowly rebuilding trust through genuine effort rather than empty apology, a career she was finally allowing herself to pursue, and a man beside her who had chosen her, publicly and repeatedly, without ever once asking her to shrink herself in return. She arrived home to find Julian waiting outside her apartment building, leaning against his car with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I wasn't expecting you tonight," she said, surprised and pleased. "I couldn't wait until tomorrow," Julian said, pushing off the car and closing the distance between them. "I've been thinking about something all evening, and I didn't want to sit with it alone." "What is it?" Julian took a slow breath, his usual composure giving way to something more vulnerable, more uncertain than she had seen from him in weeks. "I've spent most of my adult life convinced that letting someone in fully was a mistake I couldn't afford to make twice. But watching you these past months, watching you fight for your own life, your own dreams, your own family, without ever once losing your kindness in the process, I think I finally understand what my grandfather was trying to tell me." "Julian, I'm not saying anything tonight that requires an answer," he said quickly, gently. "I just needed you to know that whatever comes next, I'm not scared of it anymore. Not with you." Elena stepped closer, resting her palm against his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and sure beneath her hand. "I'm not scared either," she said softly. "Not anymore." They stood together in the quiet evening, the city humming softly around them, both of them finally, fully present in a life neither had believed they deserved, just a few short months earlier. Elena did not yet know exactly what the coming weeks would bring, how completely her sister's wedding day would change the course of her own future. But standing there with Julian's heartbeat steady beneath her palm, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and unshakably certain of where her life was heading. 3 days before Camille's wedding, a woman Elena had never met walked into the bridal shop during the final fitting and asked, quite loudly, whether anyone there could tell her where to find Julian Cross's new girlfriend. Elena turned from the mirror, still wearing her half-finished maid of honor gown, and found herself facing a striking woman with sharp features and an even sharper smile, dressed in clothes that practically announced their expense. Something about her felt immediately, instinctively wrong.
"I'm Elena,"
she said carefully. "Can I help you?" The woman's smile widened, though it never reached her eyes. "Vivian Hale. I don't believe we've met, though I imagine Julian's mentioned me."
Elena's stomach dropped.
She had heard enough about Vivian over the past months to recognize immediately why her presence here, 3 days before Camille's wedding, in the middle of a dress fitting, felt like a deliberate provocation rather than a coincidence. "He's mentioned you," Elena said evenly, refusing to let her voice waver. "Though I'm curious why you're here now." Vivian glanced around the shop, taking in the racks of dresses, the seamstresses working quietly nearby, Camille standing frozen a few feet away in her own gown, clearly uncertain what was happening. "I heard through mutual friends that Julian had found someone new. I was curious to meet the woman who managed to succeed where I apparently failed." "I'm not trying to succeed at anything," Elena said. "I'm not competing with you. Everyone competes with me, dear, whether they realize it or not." Vivian's tone remained light, almost pleasant. which somehow made the words feel sharper. I just wanted to offer you a piece of friendly advice. From one woman to another. Julian is generous, charming, easy to fall for. But he's also very good at making people believe they're special to him, right up until the moment he decides they're not. Elena felt anger rising steadily in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. I appreciate the concern, but I know Julian far better than a stranger's warning could ever tell me. Do you? Vivian's smile sharpened. Has he told you about the settlement? About how quickly his family's lawyers moved to make sure I disappeared quietly once things ended? I imagine he's painted himself as the victim in that story. He has told me everything, Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Including the parts where you tried to manipulate a grieving, guarded man into signing away control of parts of his company, before he even realized what you were doing. I know exactly who you are, Vivian. I'm not interested in whatever you're trying to accomplish here. Vivian's composure flickered, just slightly, surprise flashing behind her eyes, before she recovered her smile. How charmingly loyal. It's not loyalty, Elena said. It's simply the truth. Now, I'd appreciate it if you left. This is my sister's wedding fitting, and you're not welcome here. For a long moment, Vivian studied her, something calculating shifting behind her expression, as though reassessing an opponent she had underestimated. Finally, she shrugged. A careless, elegant gesture. Suit yourself. I hope, for your sake, that Julian's generosity extends as far as you're hoping it does. She turned and left as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving the shop in stunned silence behind her. Camille rushed over immediately, still in her wedding gown, her face pale with concern. Elena, are you all right? Who was that? Julian's ex, Elena said, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the confrontation had ended. I think she was trying to shake my confidence before the wedding, trying to plant doubt. Did it work? Camille asked gently. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. A little, she admitted. Not because I don't trust Julian, but because it's hard not to wonder, sometimes, whether I really do deserve this kind of happiness, after spending so long believing I didn't. Camille reached out and took her sister's hand, an unusually tender gesture between them. You deserve it more than anyone I know, Elena. If that woman couldn't see your worth in 5 minutes, that's her failure, not yours. That evening, Elena told Julian everything, watching his expression shift from confusion to anger to something more complicated as she described Vivian's unexpected appearance. I'm going to speak with our legal team, Julian said tightly. There was supposed to be a clear agreement that she'd stay away from anything connected to my personal life. I don't think this is about legal agreements, Elena said carefully. I think she wanted to see for herself whether I'd be easy to scare off. And were you scared? For a moment, Elena admitted. But then I remembered something. I remembered that I have spent my entire life being told, in one way or another, that I wasn't enough, that I should make myself smaller, that other people's comfort mattered more than my own worth. And I decided I wasn't going to let one more person convince me of that, especially not someone who clearly still resents losing access to your life. Julian pulled her close, relief and admiration mingling in his expression. You handled that better than I would have. I had a good teacher, Elena said softly. Watching you stand up for me that first night, watching your grandfather remind me that permission to want good things belongs to me alone. I think I finally learned how to stand up for myself. Julian kissed her forehead gently. I love you, Elena. I don't think I've said that plainly enough, often enough, but I do, completely. Elena felt the words settle into her chest, like something long awaited finally arriving. I love you too, she said, and meant it more fully than she had ever meant anything. 2 days later, with Vivian's unwelcome visit behind them and the final wedding preparations underway, Elena stood in her childhood bedroom, now mostly emptied of her belongings after her recent move into a small apartment closer to her studio, and looked at herself in the mirror one final time before the rehearsal dinner. Her father knocked softly and stepped inside, his eyes glistening as he took in the sight of her. You look so much like your mother right now, he said quietly. She would be so proud of you, Elena, not just for how far you've come, but for how you got here, by finally choosing yourself. Elena hugged her father tightly, feeling 12 years of distance finally, fully closing between them. Thank you, Dad, for seeing me, Even if it took a while. Better late than never, Gerald said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise you, from now on, I'll always be looking. That night, as the rehearsal dinner wound down and guests began drifting toward their cars, Julian found Elena on the quiet terrace outside the restaurant, the same kind of terrace where he had first found her crying months earlier, though everything about the moment now felt entirely different. Tomorrow's a big day, he said, coming to stand beside her. It is, Elena agreed, smiling softly. I'm happy for Camille. Genuinely happy. In a way I don't think I could have managed a few months ago. You've grown so much, Julian said, studying her with quiet admiration. I feel lucky to have watched it happen. Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as they looked out over the city lights together. She did not yet know what Julian had planned for the following evening, after Camille's vows were spoken and the celebration reached its peak. She only knew, standing there in the cool night air, with the man who had once stood up in a room full of strangers simply because staying silent had felt impossible, that whatever came next, she was ready for it, fully and completely, as herself. The music stopped so suddenly that Elena nearly spilled her champagne, and for one disorienting second, she thought something had gone terribly wrong. Camille's wedding reception had been unfolding beautifully all evening, string lights strung across the garden venue, laughter and music filling the warm night air, guests dancing beneath a sky scattered with stars. Camille had never looked happier, radiant beside Nathaniel as they moved through their first dance, and Elena had spent the evening watching her sister's joy, with a warmth that felt entirely uncomplicated, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Now, though, the band had gone quiet, and every head in the garden turned toward the small stage where Julian stood, microphone in hand, looking simultaneously composed and unmistakably nervous. I apologize for interrupting, Julian said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed garden. I promise this will only take a moment, and then I'll happily hand the microphone back to people far more qualified to keep a party going. A ripple of amused laughter moved through the crowd. Elena felt her heart begin to pound, some instinct warning her that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Almost exactly 6 months ago, Julian continued, I stood up at an engagement party, very similar to this one, and I said some things I hadn't planned to say, about a woman I'd only just met, because staying silent in the face of unkindness felt impossible to me that night. His eyes found Elena's across the crowded garden, warm and steady. I didn't know, standing up that first time, that it would be the beginning of the most important thing that's ever happened to me. Elena's hand rose instinctively to cover her mouth, understanding dawning slowly, disbelief and hope tangling together in her chest. Elena, Julian said, stepping down from the small stage and crossing the garden toward her, as every guest watched in stunned, delighted silence. You have taught me more about courage, about honesty, about what it means to choose yourself even after a lifetime of being told to disappear, than anyone I have ever known. You went back to school for a dream you'd buried for 12 years. You confronted your family with a kind of grace I don't think I could have managed in your position. You forgave people who hurt you, not because they demanded it, but because your heart is simply built that way. He reached her, and the entire garden seemed to hold its breath as he lowered himself onto one knee, producing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, with hands that trembled only slightly. I don't want to spend my life protecting myself from being hurt anymore, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to spend it building something real, with someone who never once asked me for anything, except honesty. Elena Marsh, will you marry me? Elena felt tears streaming freely down her face. 12 years of quiet sacrifice, and months of painful, beautiful growth, crystallizing into this single, overwhelming moment. She looked out at the garden, at her father standing with tears in his own eyes, at Camille clutching Nathaniel's arm with a joyful, generous smile, completely free of the jealousy that might once have shadowed such a moment, at Julian's grandfather beaming proudly near the back of the crowd. Yes, Elena said, her voice breaking with happiness. Yes, of course. Yes. The garden erupted into cheers as Julian slipped the ring onto her trembling finger and rose to pull her into an embrace, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by a happiness neither had quite believed themselves capable of finding. Camille rushed forward first, wrapping her sister in a fierce hug, her own wedding day joyfully expanding to include this unexpected, beautiful moment. "I can't believe you did this at my wedding," Camille said, laughing through her tears. "I asked her permission first," Julian admitted, smiling. "I wouldn't have dared otherwise." Camille turned to Elena, her expression softening into something deeply sincere. "I gave him my blessing enthusiastically. After everything I put you through, this felt like exactly the kind of moment our family needed. Proof that good things can still happen, even after we've made mistakes." Gerald reached them next, embracing his eldest daughter tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Elena. So incredibly proud." As the celebration resumed around them, the band picking up a joyful melody, guests returning to dancing and laughter, Elena found herself standing at the edge of the garden with Julian, both of them slightly breathless from the whirlwind of the past few minutes. "I have one more thing to tell you," Julian said, his expression turning slightly sheepish. "I spoke with your father a few weeks ago, asking his blessing. I wanted to do this properly." Elena felt fresh tears threatening. "You did?" "He said something I think about often now," Julian continued. "He told me that he spent 12 years failing to see how remarkable his daughter truly was, and that he hoped I wouldn't make the same mistake. I told him I intended to spend the rest of my life making sure I never did." Elena pulled him close, resting her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her ear, exactly as it had been the night he told her he was no longer afraid. Looking back over the past 6 months, Elena could hardly recognize the woman who had once sat behind a pillar at her sister's engagement party, invisible, overlooked, quietly swallowing years of accumulated hurt, because she had never believed she deserved anything different. That woman had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who had learned, slowly and painfully and beautifully, that her worth had never depended on how much she sacrificed for others, that love, freely given, did not require her own erasure, and that sometimes, the bravest thing a person could do was simply allow herself to be seen. She thought of Julian rising from his seat that first night, a stranger with nothing to gain, choosing honesty over comfortable silence simply because it felt like the right thing to do. She thought of her father's slow, painful journey toward truly seeing her, of Camille's difficult but genuine transformation from jealousy toward generosity, of her own quiet courage in returning to a dream she had buried for over a decade. Under the string lights and the wide, star-scattered sky, surrounded by a family finally healed enough to celebrate without shadows, Elena Marsh understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that every painful year of disappearing had led her, eventually, to this moment of finally, fully being found. And as Julian took her hand and led her back toward the dancing crowd, laughter and music swelling warmly around them, Elena allowed herself, at last, to simply be happy, without guilt, without apology, without ever again needing anyone's permission to want a beautiful life entirely her own.